When Alan first placed a small stick between the upper and lower jaws to keep them apart, I was amazed to see how they could open almost at a right angle. He then pushed the protective tissue back from one of the upper fangs, which it covered when not in action. As soon as the tooth was exposed, the poison dribbled out in milky drops, enough to fill a dessert spoon. Then Alan repeated the milking, which the second fang, until these two seemed empty. By then, the weight of a large puff adder has tired Alan's arm, and believing that there was no venom left in either fang, he let the snake go. Instantly, it wriggled in the nearest shelter, which was the dining hut. Hoping to prevent it from entering the door, Alan rushed after it and tried to grab it quickly behind its head without a fork stick. He missed. He tried a second time and failed again to catch it. When he touched it for the third time, the puff adder struck and bit him in the right index finger. I would never have believed that any snake, let alone the puff adder, could turn its head with such lightning speed in the opposite direction to that of the movements. While we were all concentrating on poor Alan, the snake disappeared inside the hut and went right underneath the shelf on which I kept the anti-snake bite outfits. A trade between Kenya and South Africa had come to a full stop some time previously. We had not been able to buy the Fitzsimons serum, which we regarded as the best of all the anti-snake bite serums on the market. Instead, I had one made by the Pasteur Institute and got another of a German make. This I now offered to Alan for him to choose from, but he declined both, saying that he was allergic to such remedies. He assured us that he could have received only a little poison, since both of the fangs had been completely drained, and that if he kept quiet for a while, the venom would soon be absorbed. Nevertheless, he asked to have tourniquet put on, which were relaxed every 20 minutes. Since Alan was the snake expert among us, we respected his wishes, and while he rested on a bed, listened to his stories. Meanwhile, his wife read the instructions on the German preparation very carefully, and I gave him tea and glucose at frequent intervals, for he's very thirsty. Despite his reassurances that he would soon be fit enough to visit George, I did not like the look on his hand, which was swelling alarmingly, and suggested that he should fly back immediately to Nairobi to be within reach of a doctor. But he would have none of this, and insisted that he would spend the night at the camp, and I assumed that he did this, for the rest of the party should not miss a visit to George. Since I could not force him against his will to fly in his own plane to Nairobi, I was more than relieved when at this very moment a Land Rover arrived bringing Niels Larsen, one of our pilot friends, who had previously flown visitors out to George and myself. Knowing how difficult it was for us to keep fresh fruit and vegetables, he most kindly presented me with a basket of grapes and other delicious food. He was due to return immediately with his client to Nairobi. His arrival seemed to me an act of providence. I quickly took him aside and explained the situation, whereupon he offered to take Alan and John back at once. Paying no attention to Alan's protests, we succeeded in making him and John take off with Larsen and gave them the German serum in case an emergency arose. After they had left, I sighed with relief, for I was sure that Alan was much worse than he wanted to admit, and that he was adopting a carefree attitude partly to keep up his spirits and partly so as not to spoil our evening with George. Knowing that we had done the best we could for Alan, we decided to go over to see George, but before doing it, young Trippett most gallantly caught us the puff adder. He insisted on letting it alive, so we secured it in a cardboard and released it on our way. During the drive, we watched 3 lesser kudu, one of the most attractive but shyest of antelopes, stepping gracefully out of the thick bush and posing for a photograph right in front of us. We also saw reticulated giraffe and buffalo and many smaller animals. The track led through down palm patches and wide open plain. All looked very peaceful in the light of the setting sun. By the time we reached George, we knew that Alan must be landing in Nairobi, and we hoped that he would be safe. Unfortunately, we did not see the lions of George was looking after, but even without the presence of the king of beasts, Fred Benyon was quite overwhelmed by all the animals he saw for the first time in their natural environment, and at once began to plan a holiday trip to Africa. Next morning, young Tippett had to fly to Nairobi to attend a meeting, but he was to return in the afternoon with the Roots, so they could spend a day of rest with after Alan's nasty experience. Meanwhile, Fred Benyon remained with me. When I and Tippett appeared alone at tea time, we knew that something had gone wrong. He told us that soon as the plane had taken off, Alan had become so violently ill that Joan had to inject him the full dose of anti-venom serum into him, and by the time they landed in Nairobi, he was delirious. The 3 doctors waiting for him at the hospital doubted if he would reach the hospital alive. His arm was extremely swollen and almost black. His pulse was hardly discernible, and he was only kept alive with drugs. As soon as he was strong enough to stand the operation, they feared that his arm would have to be amputated. Meanwhile, all we could do was to pray for his life. By one of the strangest coincidences, CJP Ioannidis, the world's authority on snakes, was laying in the next room to Alan. He had undergone an operation from which he was never to recover. Upon hearing the details of the accident, he was horrified by the combination of mistakes which led to Alan's collapse. To start with, Ioannidis could not conceive how anyone could think of catching any snake without a forked stick, let alone a puff adder, which was able to strike back at an angle of 180 degrees. Secondly, it was a fallacy to believe that a puff adder's fangs were empty after milking, for the ducts were instantly refilled with a far more potent poison than the one that had been milked off, which might have been in the fangs for some time and thus become weaker. Thirdly, one should never use a tourniquet for hematotoxic snakes, because the poison, when it's concentrated in a small part of a body, destroys the tissues and flesh much more quickly. So poor Alan had been a victim of our ignorance. Apart from this, 2 vital hours had been lost before his wife had been able to inject the anti-poison serum during the flight. The next 4 months were ones of great anxiety for Joan and Alan, but his arm was saved, and also his hand, by specialists on snakebite cases who were flown in from South Africa. Finally, he was treated in England. Because the tissues had been destroyed by the poison, he did lose his right index finger, but he trained himself to continue his photographic career with 4 fingers only. However scared I have been of snakes since this ghastly incident, I shall always maintain that snakes are not aggressive until provoked. which was undoubtedly the case when Alan milked his puff adder. It was also interesting to remember that in the first year that I camped here, I killed snakes almost daily during the rainy seasons. But that since then, the hiss must have been round among the snakes that my camp is not safe refuge despite the tempting hiding places it provides, so they have almost ceased to invade us. If the humans take precautions against snakes, animals also try to protect themselves and their young against them. I was fascinated when George Cook told us the story of the scene he had watched a short time earlier. He was resting in his hut during the hot hours after lunch when he heard a strange noise, like something slithering against the wire enclosure which surrounds his quarters. He went out to investigate and saw a rat cobra with a tiny rat in its mouth being fiercely attacked by the mother rat. As he watched, the rat grabbed the cobra behind its head and inflicted a severe bite. The cobra thrashed about and devouring the rid itself of his assailant, who, despite being violently thrown around, retained its grip and hung on until the cobra managed to reach a hold. Only when the rat was brushed against the edge of it did it let it go, and the snake disappeared. Unfortunately, the baby rat was dead by then, despite the courageous attack by its mother. Chapter 3: A Death in a Family. It was now the peak of the tourist season, which I enjoyed, provided the visitors did not interfere with the cheetah. This was essential if Pippa's cubs were to grow up as wild animals. Of course, I was not always popular, because the tourists could not understand why I refused to take them to see the family, but I have always kept to my principle that wild animals must never be conditioned to lose their fear of man. Pippa seems to share my attitude and disapproved even I took greater familiarities with her children that she considered fair. One day they were most interested in me, brushing themselves deliberately against my legs and toddling close around me, ignoring Pippa's purr purr and evident wish that this game should stop. 3 times she carried them into a thicket, but the cubs were equally determined and sauntered back as soon as she dropped them. The smallest cub was especially friendly and followed me wherever I went. When Pippa made an attempt to suckle her young at her usual time, 10 a.m., I left. Next morning I placed myself well hidden from the cubs behind a bush and watched them climbing onto Pippa's back and sliding off the other side, nibbling at her ears until a jerk of her head sent them flying. Then they rolled playfully on the ground, holding each other's down, spanking and biting, or sitting on each other's heads till their mother came to the rescue, licking and purring, and they all settled down to their meal at 10 o'clock sharp. Seeing Pippa today so much at ease, perhaps because she knew I was close yet not interfering with her young, I was impressed. But Elsa, puzzled at her seeming to want our friendship to be restricted to herself, was this due to an instinct to preserve the natural relationship between herself and her family, despite the fact that she had trusted me and had accepted me as her foster mother since she had been 6 months old? She demonstrated a similar attitude on her following day when I found the family under a new bush. The plain was more open here, and the grass shorter, and the cubs could move about more easily. On my arrival, Pippa emerged and sniffed at the meat. Then she returned quickly to the cubs. After reassuring herself that they were well hidden, she led me nearly 100 yards away before eating. She had never objected a local being near while she had her meal, so I was surprised to see her growling and returning hurriedly to her family when he approached us. By next morning she had moved to a large acacia with low-hanging branches forming a shady dome over Termite Hill, and surrounded by such thick undergrowth that it was impossible to see the cheetah unless they moved. At last I detected the cubs, who kept absolutely still. Some time later Pippa turned up from the direction of the Mulika River, looked suspiciously around, and after making sure the cubs were safe, walked off again. I followed her for 15 minutes, repeatedly offering her meat, but she ate so little that when she returned to her cubs, I placed the remains on the ground. That evidently was the last thing I wanted to do, and looking in the opposite direction, she soon retired deep inside the lair. Meanwhile, the cubs came to investigate the new scent and cautiously approached the meat, but when they were quite close, they wrinkled their noses in disgust and spat at it. Soon after this, I left. At tea time, I again tried my luck, and I was surprised to find Pippa waiting for us at some distance from her lair, for this was an unusual hour for us to visit her. She was extremely thirsty and quickly lapped the water we had brought before returning, in wide circles, to the cubs. When we came within 50 yards of them, she looked hard at Loco, stopped dead, and would not budge until I sent him back. Only after he was out of sight she did go to her cubs and suckle them. The following morning we searched for 2 hours before we almost stepped on the family right in the open. I offered Pippa meat some distance away from her children, but she barely nipped at it and seemed more interested in finding cover for them. It looked as if we had caught them on the way to the Mulika River, because she soon moved on again in that direction, the little ones toddling behind as best they could, except for the smallest one, which Pippa had to carry for most of the distance. Although she gazed longingly toward the Mulika, she had to give the cubs a rest, and then at last she consented to eat. Remembering that only yesterday the cubs were making faces at the meat, it was astonishing now to see one of the males tearing so heartily at it that Pippa nipped him frequently to prevent him from eating too much. The cubs were 5 weeks old that day, and this was exactly the age at which Whitey, Billy, and Tadu had first touched meat. It took 3 more days for other cubs to join in the new diet, during which time Pippa moved to several new lairs. With the cubs now eating meat, I took great care to leave no trace of it behind, which might attract predators, and always placed it on a piece of canvas so that no scent should infiltrate the ground. Pippa had always been a perfect mother, and therefore I could not understand why she now cuffed the cubs as soon as I put the meat in front of them, or calling purr purr moved off before they could eat. They were keen enough, and their teeth sufficiently well developed to tackle meat, but often they had to be content with chewing at sticks instead. Why, I wondered, did she prevent them from eating meat? The little ones were thin but very lively and played vigorously in the early mornings, only sitting down to sleep when the sun became too hot. It was not until 6 days after the cubs had shown their first interest in meat that Pippa made a point of showing them how to eat. She sucked the intestines into her mouth between her teeth, thus squeezing out the contents. She also demonstrated how to lap water from the bowl, but the cubs were not too good at that for a few days. The family had recently moved onto a more open part of the plain with isolated bushes scattered around. They were ideal layup since hidden inside their dense foliage and well protected from the sun. Pippa could detect the slightest danger approaching from long distance. I was therefore amazed when we found the place one morning occupied by a herd of 7 elephants, two of them right next to the bush from which Pippa emerged to get her meal. She ate it, apparently unconcerned about the elephants, who browsed for some 10 minutes off the bush under which her cubs were hidden. Even when one of the giants churned up the earth with his front leg into a cloud of dust, she showed no anxiety, but quietly chewed away. We had to wait what seemed a very long time for the elephants to move far enough for us to get near the cubs. Judging by the spoor, these giants had been within 2 yards of the family for a long time. By the time we reached them, the little ones were very hungry and fought for their share. They even defended their meat from Pippa so that they could drag it deep inside the bush where they felt safe to eat it. Once they had had their fill, they jumped playfully on their mothers as if she were a rock, tearing at her skin and ears in no gentle way. But she seemed to love this game, and closing her eyes, purred the more and more the cubs maltreated her head. During the next days, the elephants became a nuisance as far as we concerned. Often we had to wait a long time before we could look under promising bushes where the family might be concealed, only to find that Pippa had remained apparently quite deliberately right among the herd. She had never shown fear, rhino, hippo, elephants, and obviously she was making good use of them now to protect her family from a troop of baboons which had also invaded the place. One morning, we looked for many hours for cheetah, especially in the vicinity of 3 thorn bushes which had recently been their lair. We saw no sign of the family, but found 6 elephants persistently beside the bushes. Exhausted, we gave up at midday. When at tea time we continued our search, we found out elephants still guarding the 3 bushes from which Pippa soon emerged in response to my calls. Simultaneously, 6 elephants came thundering and trumpeting across the plain, but luckily swerved off in the opposite direction as soon as they got our scent, while the single one moved toward the road. I offered Pippa only the small piece of meat which concealed her daily dose of calcium, and withheld the rest of her meal, hoping that she would show us her cubs. But she was no fool, and stubbornly refused to move until it was almost dark, and now I had to give in. After she had eaten, she walked extremely carefully, avoiding making any sound, even the breaking of a twig, for about 3/4 of a mile towards the road, where we caught up with a single elephant. Anxiously, I looked for the cubs, and found them well concealed in the high grass almost at my feet. Quickly, I placed the meat in front of them, but they remained immobile until Pippa called "purr purr," after which they rushed for it. It was now quite dark, and being concerned about the safety of the cubs eating in such an open place, we sat with them until they had finished their meal. This took some time, for with their small teeth they could chew only very slowly, and I had to divert Pippa's interest so that she could not take advantage of this delay to finish off the meat while listening to their munchings. I heard for the first time a cub imitating Pippa's purr purr. They were now 6 weeks old and had been moved to 14 different layers up to date, but never once so long a distance as today. Since they could all walk quite well, I assumed they had outgrown their early nursery stage. They were a lovely quartet. The two big males, one slightly larger than the other and very plucky, always kept close together and already had an air of self-assurance which the two smaller cubs liked, especially the female, who was very nervous and often sat apart while the brothers played together. But all were most affectionate and always cuddle up to Pippa, who was devoted to them. Early next morning, I found the cheetah at the same place, still close to the single elephant. Pippa was keeping a lookout from a fallen tree. The big male cub clambered up to her, but although he tried hard to keep his balance, he fell off several times. Then he lapped the water from the bowl with great gusto. After all had eaten, the family gamboled to the road and settled for their midday rest within 100 yards of it under a bushy tree. I was worried at leaving the cubs so close to the road, and returned in the afternoon, hoping to entice them for a walk and get them moving into the plains. But Pippa seemed tense. She kept hiding deep inside in a bush and would not budge. All night I felt extremely anxious, and as soon as it was light, we went to look for them but found the place deserted. Instead, we saw fresh lion spoor not far along the road. We screened the area for about half an hour until Pippa appeared, coming from mile 5, where the mulika crossed the road. Sniffing the ground, she led me in a roundabout way to a bushy tree, but then sat put at some distance while I walked around it. When I reached the other side, hidden from Pippa, my heart stood still, for there I saw the big male cub, dead beaten through his neck. He lay close to the bush, and there was no trace of blood on the grass or any sign of a fight. The blood on his wound was still fresh when I picked up the slightly stiffed body to take it to the car. Pippa did not see what I was carrying and walked on. Local and I followed her as she went sniffing along the road in the opposite direction from which she had come. After some 200 yards, we saw her morning tracks among the cub spoor. Here she turned off in the direction of the tree bushes, sniffing the ground even more intensely and climbing every tree and termite hill. She was looking at all surroundings with hard eyes. Then she settled near a bush from which she did not move, although she listened constantly and watched for any slight movement. I took the opportunity to send Local for her food. After Local had brought her the meat, she took so long to eat it that I feared her other cubs were also dead. Finally she moved off, and as she passed a twin bush, I heard a wee sound coming from it, like the chirping of a bird. Ignoring this, Pippa walked on while I had a look good inside of the foliage, where I detected the 3 cubs. Pippa stopped some 100 yards further on and rested there for a good half hour, always listening alertly for more chirps. We could not understand her behavior. Did she not trust us? Was she unwilling to give away the whereabouts of her surviving cubs? This seems to be confirmed when later on she returned to the road and carefully avoided the twin bush. As soon as we reached the turnoff where the cub had been killed, she sat down.